The Omaha class represented the single transitional class of cruiser that the US Navy would produce, a stepping stone between the old paradigm of the protected and armoured cruisers and the era of the 10,000-ton treaty cruiser that would arise soon after. By the middle of the 1910s, with World War I in full swing, the US Navy found itself in a position of not having laid down a single cruiser since before the commissioning of HMS Dreadnought, and the rapidly developing naval war in European waters was showing that the small, fragile protected cruisers and the big, slow armoured cruisers basically had an effective combat power of really? In anything other than peripheral theatres. The problem was those kinds of cruisers were all the US Navy had in terms of its cruiser fleet. This wasn't actually the US Navy's fault. They'd wanted modern cruisers, battle cruisers, destroyers, and all sorts of other things for quite a while, but funding had been so limited that they'd been forced to prioritise basically just keeping up with the battleship race and maintaining the rest of their existing fleet. But what this meant was that as the fleet standardised to a 21-knot battle line, the cruiser screen was now only barely faster, at least on a good day, and in the cases of many ships, actually about the same speed or slower than the battleships, especially when it came to rough weather. This in turn meant that in any fleet engagement, an enemy force would be able to scout the location and position of the US fleet without the US having a fleet screen capable of repelling them. And the US Admiral, in his turn, would have no idea what the enemy was doing until they showed up in gun range. This would lead, almost inevitably, to a battle that was entirely on the enemy's terms. Thus, it was clear the US Navy needed a new class of cruisers. This would become the Omaha class. The idea followed the trends of the time for so-called scout or light armoured cruisers, which were trending towards larger 6-inch weapons as compared to the lighter, approximately 4-inch batteries of the older designs that sometimes had a 6-inch or two thrown in for good measure. Also required was high speed. Even with the new ships, the US Navy would still be building a good chunk of the fleet screen out of destroyers, specifically the start of the then new Wickes and Clemson swarm, and so an unusually high top speed of 35 knots was desired to allow the new cruisers to keep up with the new destroyers. The high speed requirement inevitably meant a larger ship than average, and when the design was finalised, it looked to top up at around 7,000 tons, which was significantly larger than the various iterations of the C-class that the Royal Navy was building in the mid-1910s, and with even the German Köln class, a new design that was based on wartime experience, clocking in at almost 1,500 tons less. It also meant that for the 90,000 shaft horsepower needed to drive the ship on its 4 screws, they would also have to have 4 funnels, which meant that at a distance, it was entirely possible to get the cruisers and their 4-stacker destroyer companions somewhat confused. On such a relatively large hull, the opportunity was therefore present to mount a considerable gun battery. This is the US after all. Although here the ships showed a weird mix of old and new. The main battery consisted of no less than a dozen 6-inch guns, but 4 of them were mounted in very modern twin turrets, one fore and one aft, whilst the other 8 were all placed in a relatively anachronistic casemate mounting, which in an even more old-school move were placed in double-stacked casemate pairs at the 4 corners of the ship's overall superstructure. This gave an 8-gun broadside, but also a theoretical 6-gun fore and aft salvo. As this was the 1910s, other guns were limited to a couple of single 3-inch to let enemy aircraft know that they'd been spotted, although this was doubled to a mighty 4 during construction. But unlike later US cruisers, the ships would carry torpedo tubes, originally 10 in total, again unusually laid out with 2 triple launchers on deck and 2 twin launchers, a deck lower down in the hull, firing through opening side plates. Mine rails and fittings for mines themselves were also installed on the quarterdeck aft. Protection came courtesy of 3 inches of belt armour. There were a couple of aircraft on catapults just after the funnels as well. They were thus incredibly heavily armed by the standards of the day, and 10 of them would be built, with construction starting between 1918 and 1920, the ships commissioning between 1923 and early 1925. But upon entry into service, a few issues started to show. Despite their size, they were still badly overloaded, and severe weight-saving measures taken in building the hull to reach the desired speed meant that the ships leaked quite a bit, sat low in the water, and the lower torpedo tubes and the lower aft casement mounts were pretty much consistently being flooded. Over time, the mine rails would be removed, as would the lower set of torpedo tubes and the aft lower 6-inch casement-mounted guns, although this last measure was not done in all ships. As other larger cruisers and more capable aircraft came online during the interwar period, the Omaha class would gradually be moved mainly into the flotilla leader role as part of the fleet screen, as opposed to the more active scouting role. Towards the end of the 1930s, the ships were seen as increasingly obsolete, and there was some discussion on converting them into anti-aircraft cruisers, although this hadn't actually been done by the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, albeit that their anti-aircraft battery had been upgraded and would of course continue to increase during the course of the war. With their overall somewhat lesser capabilities, they were mostly dispatched to secondary areas of operation, although USS Marblehead and USS Richmond would see action in a few of the more notable actions of World War II. Largely as a result of this, the class suffered no wartime losses and would all survive the war, although with so many new-build cruisers, they were deemed surplus to requirements at this point and all sent to the scrapyard less than a year after the war ended, with the sole exception of the USS Milwaukee, which had joined HMS Royal Sovereign in the suffering that was being loaned to the World War II Soviet Navy, with the ship being returned and mercifully put out of its misery in 1949.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.